OT Rose, and today we're going to be talking about belonging again, II.1, and we're going to be talking about section 1-2. So this is in chapter 1, and this is, last time we spoke about Plato and the allegory of the cave, and this interesting question of who let Plato out of the cave, the first prisoner, and how this really brings to the forefront this question of intrinsic motivation, drive, and kind of this ultimate failsafe on this question of this kind of limit case on if no one ever came for a prisoner who was in the cave, if no one ever came for a prisoner in the cave, how would they get out? So, last time we were talking about the allegory of the cave, and here we're going to continue that line of thought with a section called Plato, Nietzsche, and Bestow Centrism. And this is also going to be based on a paper that you can find in the Philosophy Portal anthology called Abyssal Arrows. And so, the Overman and the Allegory of the Cave, the problem of intrinsic motivation and living as children of Zarathustra, is a paper which was featured in Abyssal Arrows, an anthology released in 2023 by Philosophy Portal. My full argument can be found there, but here I will incorporate some of the sections and ideas to help frame what is at stake in considering the question, how does anyone leave Plato's cave on their own? At least one of Nietzsche's core projects can be seen as the deconstruction of what I call Bestow Centrism, which is to say the prevalence of a dynamic of transaction, handing down, giving, and so forth at the expense of becoming, which is to say we do and think like we do because of something external and extrinsic. Nietzsche seeks and defends a dynamic of self-incubation, self-development, and the like, devoid of transaction as much as possible, where we operate more internally and intrinsically. And again, this relates to being left in the cave by oneself, because if you're the only one down there and nobody comes for you, how are you going to leave, right? We need more becoming than bestowing, though ultimately it's impossible for us to live without both to some degree. The question is only to what degree and what proportion. But in a world of Bestow Centrism, the exact opposite is the case. We have not yet thought Plato's allegory of the cave without being dragged out, and this is what Nietzsche challenges us to do. For us to succeed, or succeed more than fail, is for us to become the children of Zarathustra. They walk out of the cave into the sun alone. If we do not accept this challenge, we will not encounter the limits of what we can accomplish, which Nietzsche, after the death of God, believed we had no choice but to try. And Belonging Again, Part 1, concurs. The argument which the paper explores can be summarized as follows, and this is the paper in Abyssal Arrows. Nietzsche locates and deconstructs a fundamental assumption of Western philosophy, suggesting a revolution akin to both Heidegger and Derrida. Western philosophy emphasizes bestowing over becoming, which is to say the emphasis is on the extrinsic and external over the intrinsic and internal. In the West, the emphasis is on receiving or giving one's work, ideology, truth, understanding, favoring discourse over rhetoric, terms which at this point in this book don't make sense, I admit, so do forgive. Where Nietzsche would have us cultivate our work, ideology, truth, understanding, and so on as much as possible, though some degree of tragedy seems unavoidable. As Derrida called for an end to logocentrism, the pursuit of presence, totality, finality, and the like, so Nietzsche called for an end to Bestow Centrism, which moralizes and emphasizes transferences between entities like individual systems, notions, and so on. The death of God represents only one piece of this larger vision, and ultimately a movement away from Bestow Centrism is for us to learn to leave Plato's cave on our own. To outline the argument of the paper, we could say that Nietzsche isn't a systematic philosopher, but he does have a coherent vision. He is what I might metaphorically call a core thinker, as we'll discuss again with Ivan Illich. Imagine the Earth's core and imagine lava spurting out in different spots across the surface. The spurts wouldn't be directly connected, and yet they would be connected through the common core, and thus from one spurt we could make connections with other spurts. This is what I mean when I say Nietzsche is a core thinker. His ideas can be connected, for they all share the same hot source. Unfortunately, Nietzsche's coherent core vision cannot be readily relayed through traditional philosophy, for it is a critique of the Bestow Centrism which partly defines traditional philosophy. Furthermore, we don't search for the coherent vision in Nietzsche because we have been trained to think of Nietzsche as a giant critic, a prophet raging in the wilderness. There is truth to this, but it can influence how we read his books. Furthermore, Nietzsche may himself have more so intuited his core versus clearly stated it, but that still means his bursts represent constant and consistent vision that can be theorized. Additionally, though The Birth of Tragedy and Genealogy of Morals are written more like traditional books, the rest of Nietzsche's non-literary work can seem like a collection of random insights. So it's understandable why we approach Nietzsche like we do, though I think it's a mistake to see his work too aphoristically. You'll also see in a lot of the publications of Nietzsche, the sections are divided by numbers. It kind of feels like it's a bunch of unrelated ideas. But if you were to just remove the numbers and to read it just kind of straight, I think you get a very different experience. And I think actually by not reading Nietzsche that way, you do get a kind of understanding of someone who's kind of all over the place. And I think that's a big problem. I do think there is a unified core to what Nietzsche is doing. To resume. Nietzsche intuits that Western philosophy skips the question of how someone leaves Plato's cave on their own without being dragged. And furthermore, the West has depicted the philosopher as mostly someone who enlightens and teaches people, which is to say, drags out others. A role Nietzsche resists in his Zarathustra. Nietzsche locates a background of bestowing versus becoming in religion, science, education, culture, everywhere, and proceeds to critique Bestow Centrism wherever he sees it. Like Derrida's critique of logocentrism, this might seem mundane, but it means we must reconsider philosophy beyond bestowing in the same way Derrida leads us into considering philosophy beyond presence. This leads us into asking, is philosophy without presence possible? As we could ask, is an intrinsic philosophy possible? If not, we might not have an answer for how we might leave Plato's cave on our own. It will all be random, perhaps dooming us to the negative fate suggested in part 1 of Belonging Again. To deconstruct Bestow Centrism is pedagogically significant, socially consequential, individually transformative. Nietzsche understood the depths of the change. What does it mean to philosophize without handing something off? What does it mean to teach without bestowing? Is that possible? Numerous questions arise. But as in following Derrida, we can learn that presence is impossible and so begin to think according to lack. So realizing the problems with Bestow Centrism can open us to begin playing with possibilities of becoming. Nietzsche discusses the difference between slave morality and master morality, and we can associate slave morality with Bestow Centrism. Slave morality is an ethic of good versus evil, while master morality is an ethic of noble versus contemptible, the former of which requires us to own for ourselves something that we believe is good and valuable, a move which will require internal coordination, as we'll discuss, and is existentially difficult, hence why Bestow Centrism seems so natural. An upcycle. It's good to see you. I hope you are doing well. We are talking about Nietzsche, the question of Bestow Centrism, and you can find a presentation on this at Philosophy Portal under the conference tabs. And also Philosophy Portal is starting the Philosophy of Right class tomorrow. I highly suggest it. And the argument is that there's a connection between Nietzsche's work as a kind of coherent questioning of the possibility of self-becoming and the question of leaving Plato's cave on our own. And in the same way that Derrida critiques logocentrism, a philosophy of presence, so I think Derrida critiques what I would call Bestow Centrism. But to resume, I believe Book 5 of The Gay Science is unique in unveiling Nietzsche's core against Bestow Centrism. And a large section of my paper on Abyssal Arrows explores it to show the numerous ways Nietzsche deconstructs Bestow Centrism. Book 5 is arguably a unique blueprint reviewing the advanced and developed thinking of Nietzsche. It not only critiques religion as bestowing, but science, utilitarianism, and more. Nietzsche argues that we constantly flee to something external and or metaphysical, seek knowledge as familiarity to avoid anxiety, and other practices which save us the hard and exhausting work of nobility. The main paper explores each section in detail, both to make the case and to show that Nietzsche can be read as a developing thought, not just aphoristic. A few sections which can help us understand that Nietzsche's critique of religion is more egalitarian and fundamentally of a critique of Bestow Centrism. You have, for example, science. He critiques science as a bestowing phenomenon on, I believe that's section 344. He critiques logic as a way to avoid becoming in favor of bestowing. That's section 348. Knowledge, where we tend to seek knowledge that is familiar, not knowledge that is new, so it bestows a feeling of familiarity. That's section 355. We use our profession to avoid becoming. That's 356. and then many on religion and culture. He critiques pragmatism, he critiques nationalism. He certainly sees religion as a main way that people avoid becoming, but it's not just religion in Book 5. There are many sources of bestowing that impede upon becoming and then get in the way of us needing to value things, to choose things as valuable or virtuous, noble versus contemptible, which is the language out of the genealogy of morals. So it's not just religion. There are many ways that we avoid becoming. But to resume, in Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche also critiques utilitarianism as problematic, suggesting that we believe what is useful is realized as such, when really it tends to be according to a socioeconomic system which has bestowed on us the framework in which use is so defined. With this morality, as with all Bestow Centrism, the individual is instructed to be a function of the herd and to ascribe value to himself only as a function. Starting with section 343 and numbering accordingly, the Overman and the Allegory of the Cave, which is the paper in Abyssal Arrows, covers the main ideas of each section of Book 5 of the Gay Science. And through the summations, I believe we can spot a gradually developing vision, which further justifies the consideration of Nietzsche as a core thinker. For those interested, I highly suggest picking up a copy of Abyssal Arrows today. Relevant for Plato and how teachers drag out prisoners, thus spoke Zarathustra alternatively analyzes what occurs if the teacher-student relationship is deconstructed into the teacher-student becoming from followers to children, per se. The story of Zarathustra can be read as a realization that the teacher-to-student relationship can be a way in which both teachers and students can hide from their own becoming, which can shed light on Zarathustra's behavior toward the end of Book 1. In this way, we can say that those who might leave Plato's cave on their own are those who undergo a process like children, according to Nietzsche, like as does Zarathustra, which we can associate with becoming children, according to Nietzsche. If this sounds impossible, perhaps perfectly it is impossible, but Nietzsche suggests that there are historical and everyday examples of this reality, mainly the noble class, as discussed in the genealogy of morals and Beyond Good and Evil, section 260. Thus, however difficult and rare avoiding bestowing might be to some degree, it can happen, which means there is reason to give the effort to live more bestowed a shot, which I would consider living with intrinsic motivation. Furthermore, though the main paper would have to elaborate on the point, if there are real and historic examples of being which isn't bestowed, there must be an ontological and metaphysical background which makes this possible, which gives us space to consider capital W will in light of author Schopenhauer and even 360 of the Gay Science. And I think that's a good association upcycle. There's absolutely the beginning of Zarathustra coming out of the cave and going to the people, I definitely think is pointing to Plato. That's exactly right. To spread childhood to the majority, we must think beyond Bestow Centrism, and also it ends in the cave as well. So, which is to say, we must think the possibility of leaving Plato's cave without being dragged. How might we think as a prisoner for whom no one comes? God is dead can mean there is no one ready to drag us out. Alexander Bard associates the death of God with the death of a paradigm, and for me, this suggests the death of the world where we could hope to be dragged out of Plato's cave, which is the loss and or corruption of extrinsic motivation, which we could associate with sociological givens. I think it's also the neurotic and Lacan. You could think authority and so on. Anyway, now I'm certainly not saying that extrinsic motivation is dead. It's everywhere. But I am saying that extrinsic motivation, which we could trust with plausible deniability at least, is fading and weakening. If not entirely gone, we know capitalism is trying to capture us with algorithms and the like, considering to lose. We know the media is engaged in the business of propaganda, see Zach Stein, and institutions of all kinds have weakened and lost legitimacy. Göran Habermas talks about that. We struggle to know how to be extrinsically motivated without contributing to the failing institutions which are ruining the world or prone to oppress, without joining a corporate system that dehumanizes or entering into family structures that we saw bring our parents unhappiness. We see the troubles of extrinsic motivation, which is to live in accordance with extrinsic structures and systems, but we also don't readily have the resources to escape extrinsic motivation, and so we are pathological and despairing. Thus, we undergo what some have called the meaning crisis, an explosion of mental health problems, suicide, depression, and so on. And in this state, we seem ill-prepared to face the meta-crisis. The meaning crisis as a sign of hope by O.G. Rose argued that we could escape the meaning crisis by lowering our moral standards and returning to classic sources of meaning like war, racism, and closed-mindedness. And the piece encouraged us to realize that suffering the meaning crisis entailed a nobility, actually. The meaning crisis should not be viewed as something we stumbled into foolishly, but something self-imposed, like seen in Thomas More and other martyrs who died for what they believed in. However, since death and the apocalypse aren't exactly ideal, we need to address the meaning crisis. For not resorting to previous avenues for meaning, we find ourselves not knowing what to do, but still left with the problem of what to do, which intrinsic motivation might help us with in our present clearing. This is for us to be children, as Nietzsche encouraged, for children are those who might leave Plato's cave on their own. But how do we become children? Does anyone know, or is it random and unpredictable like the movement of some Christian grace? So what we mean by this is we actually do know how to get meaning. We can join nationalism, racism, we can be closed-minded. These things can all give you meaning and even belonging. But the problem is they are immoral and very problematic. And so the meaning crisis is a result of refusing methods of meaning that we believe are immoral or they're not high enough of a standard. And so there's a way to view the meaning crisis as like Thomas More, there's a play called A Man for All Seasons and a tremendous movie, which is the idea that Thomas More at any point could have gotten out of prison and avoided execution by granting the king the divorce, but he refused. So likewise, I think we need to see a certain nobility in the meaning crisis, a certain refusal to lower our standards, because if we don't do that, then it feels like we're just a bunch of idiots who stumbled into a dark alley and can't find their way out. But if instead there's a reading of it that suggests that the meaning crisis is a result of higher standards, there's a nobility there that can be a source of hope. Not naivety, but at least a source of hope. To resume, as belonging again, part 1 left us to consider generating intrinsic motivation is for me central to becoming an absolute knower, Deleuzian, individual, and or Overman, all of which is only possible if we can answer the following. How can we leave Plato's cave on our own? This is the question of how we can incubate intrinsic motivation, and if the answer is we cannot, it's genetic, then I fear there might be no way for the world to rise to the occasion of the new paradigm emerging after the death of God. A minority of people will, but not the majority. To improve our prospects, we must realize that the new paradigm does not allow us to assume any of the following. Someone forces others to become philosopher kings. Someone else identifies philosopher kings. It is not our responsibility to be philosopher kings, but a responsibility given to us. If we are not philosopher kings, we don't have to worry if we should be, and so on. These points alone suggest the difference between prisoners who are forced to become philosopher kings and potential prisoners who choose to become philosopher kings. This minor detail radically transforms the implications of the allegory, so much, in fact, that a whole philosophy must arise to address it, in my view. And that entire philosophy is what I think we can see in Nietzsche, and though it was possible for centuries to plausibly deny the need for this entire philosophy, while God was around and we could perhaps trust in a big other who could anoint or elect us, through all the ways described in Book 5 of the Gay Science, Nietzsche understood that gradually and slowly people would come to realize that God was dead, and thus the plausible deniability run out. When that occurred, if humanity wasn't ready, the responses could prove pathological. That's sure the great guy. Yeah, there you go. I like that upcycle. That's nice. That's a nice association. Very good. As Nietzsche puts it, and on the genealogy of morals, we must shake off a certain mistrust of ourselves, for we cannot evaluate anything if we don't trust our own capacities to comprehend and judge. Layman Pascal emphasizes the need for meta-evaluation if we are to address our current problems, but we will prove incapable of evaluation without first moving through Nietzsche, which will further require us to rethink Plato and the whole Republic. The allegory of the cave is perhaps the founding myth of Western philosophy. So if we are to reevaluate all values to make possible the spread of childhood in favor of rhetoric, this myth must be transformed. We easily misremember the allegory as prisoners leaving on their own. We perhaps hide from ourselves the true narrative so that we convince ourselves that we have addressed Bestow Centrism when we have not. A similar ironic move is made in Derrida with presence, where we act like we know about the problem of presence, so that it can seem like we've addressed it. In truth, we've perhaps not even faced our unwillingness to face. The title of the gay science suggests the science of being happy, and for me, happiness and dancing in Nietzsche are strongly connected. Thus, Nietzsche is telling us about the science of dancing. The gay science is the science of gaiety, which further suggests why it is uniquely positioned to highlight Nietzsche's project. It is also important to note that in section 341, in book 4, is the eternal return, as if this thought is what inspires Nietzsche to write Zarathustra. With seeing the impact the eternal return has on Zarathustra easily could be the case. This in mind, the matter of deconstructing Bestow Centrism is a matter of unleashing a will to dance, and perhaps we could say that the only ones who can leave Plato's cave on their own are those who dance out. But Western philosophy has not thought this, or such could be argued through Nietzsche, as Heidegger argued being was forgotten, and perhaps we have not thought such intrinsic motivation, because all fields might have to be rethought. Indeed, it would suggest that we need to approach everything beyond low-order discourse, which would be a revolution indeed. And it should be noted that the gay science, book 4, ends with the parable, the madman, God is dead, and the eternal return. Then Nietzsche goes off, writes Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and I think Beyond Good and Evil. Then he comes back and writes book 5. And so he was quite taken. And I do think that Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Mills, good to see you, sir. Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil are therefore uniquely positioned to help us see Nietzsche's core thinking. And I do think, basically the genealogy of morals and book 5 of the gay science are much more formally straightforward of Nietzsche's thought. And then, of course, once you get into the later Nietzsche, kind of the 1890s, I think he's basically at that point descended into madness. So to really get a sense of his core as a critique of Bestow Centrism, I think book 5 of the gay science is uniquely positioned to be quite useful. To resume, for Nietzsche, beyond good and evil, a child can Christian a thing as noble and bear the existential weight of that Christianing, which entails intrinsic motivation, while non-children understand things as good and bad according to what is externally bestowed upon them. Children motivate themselves according to the value they choose or create, while non-children are motivated. What concerns Nietzsche is when good simply means the opposite of evil, where people cannot say for themselves positively what is good. This is slave morality. We cannot produce our own line of flight, Deleuze, in a world where good is only the opposite of evil. We require values, which include goods, yes, but with more substance than being a mere opposite. It is non-children who Nietzsche has in mind when he warns that religion can birth enemies of the spirit, even if there is every now and then a rare piece of humanity that the people revere. How might religion change to emerge to more of the rare versus the fearful? But we see in book 5, The Gay Science, how many fields can bring about non-children. Science can prove a source of bestowing, as can pragmatism, nationalism, everything. And indeed, humans can look to any and everything to avoid choice, valuation, and anxiety. But if we do not change, belonging, again, part 1, cannot be addressed. Nietzsche declares that nothing exists apart from the whole, and thus nothing exists independent from everything else. To judge, measure, compare, condemn, the world is singular, and there being no other God, final judgment is impossible. This is liberating, but this also means we are liberated to judge for ourselves, and this is something we only have hope to handle with a doctrine of nobility and master morality. According to our values, Nietzsche would have us own Plato's cave, in the sense that we own the reality that we are oriented toward becoming last men. But Nietzsche would have us own this precisely so that we avoid affirming Plato's cave. This is to lose our potential for becoming Overman. To own is to avoid problematic affirming, whereas if we never own, we end up affirming by default. Nietzsche is a philosopher of affirming only what we own. This is for us to contribute to discourse over rhetoric, terms we'll get into, which is for us to contribute to the spread, not of childhood, but the last men. And that brings us to the close of the section. That was 1-2, belonging again, II.1. I should also note we will be having a class at Parallax on belonging again. That will be starting in July. It will be Sundays in July. We're very much looking forward to it. And again, what we're saying when we say that Nietzsche is a core thinker, like again, if we think of there being kind of a hot core that is spurting out all over the planet. You can say, oh, it's all random, the spurts are unrelated, but the spurts are all united by a core that is all over the place. So there's something going on. So we see throughout Nietzsche a constant critique of sources of bestowing, where we get our values from something external to us, which then, of course, the issue is that's a way to avoid anxiety. That's a way to avoid taking responsibility for our choices, because we can always say, well, we only did it because it was rational. We only did it because it was logical. We only did it because it was good. We only did it because the church told us to. We only did it because we're European. We only did it because it was practical. You know, the moment you say, I made this decision because X, and thus give it a basis and justification outside of the decision, that is what Nietzsche is concerned about. Because really the death of God is the announcement of the need for people to be able to make choices that are what are all called absolute choices. Choices that are their own grounding as themselves. And if we cannot do that, then we're going to become, well, we can use the Lacanian term neurotic. You see, what ends up happening is you're neurotic, but you can't find an absolute basis by which to ground that neurotic, which loves authority. So every authority you find, you're going to have to exist with in a kind of pathological, fragile, self-deceptive relationship to hide from yourself the problems with that authority, which could lead to modern totalitarianism, strongmen, popularism, etc., so forth. But then, of course, you could also take the death of God to be the pure release that Philip Reeve critiques, where then anything goes and you can do anything. But you see, where anything goes, then the choices we can make lose significance, and why make choice X versus choice Y? Then there's no reason to make choices, or we can just be, we have no defense from our own wants and desires, and we can be destroyed by them because there's nothing to shield them from us. So we need a capacity to make choice that is very authoritative. Nietzsche will talk about hanging a law over your own neck. So there's this idea that you're able to create things that have authority over you. But of course, if you created the authority, how can it have authority over you? Can't you? Don't you know that it's ultimately arbitrary? How can this even work? Well, these are some of the dimensions and dilemmas that we find. That we need in the world today. Like, if you decided, like, where would the idea even come from to leave Plato's cave on your own? Where would that even come from? Would a shadow tell you to do that? No. So why would you even think to leave Plato's cave on your own? Likewise, why would you ever choose something that has authority over you that is not objectively grounded? Why would you do that? Well, these, for Nietzsche, basically, if we can't do this, then we're in big trouble. And we will go from there. For more, Belonging Again II.1, please find it on Amazon. Please find part 1 is also on Amazon. You can find some of the playlists. There's a playlist on YouTube that will be going through Belonging Again II.1. There's a few conversations. I had a wonderful one with Cadell. And thank you so much for your time. And again, there's a Parallax course. You can go to Parallax, the website, and learn more. That will be about this book. And thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it very much. Good to see everyone. Upcycle Mills, thank you all for coming by. All the best. All the best. Thank you so much.